This is the old graveyard, West Bridgewater. It was founded in 1683. This is the first recording there is of a cemetery in town. Before that, people were buried probably in their backyards, in the farmyard, and in different places. And over the years, as people have dug up their farm areas and everything else, they have found traces of old graves. I know in 1822 they found them complete with the casket and everything. Who they were, we don't know. And what they did with them, I really couldn't tell you. But this is the oldest graveyard in West Bridgewater. If you look at the name graveyard, graveyards and burying grounds are the old names. Okay, and when you see a graveyard, normally they are connected to a church. And the second site of the old first church in West Bridgewater was not far from here. So this was the cemetery for that church to start with. And then as time goes on, you will find that the name cemetery comes out. Like a Melrose Cemetery with 40,000 people buried there. These are smaller. They're older, they're smaller. And you will find that you can tell it by the stones. Most of them start to deteriorate and everything because they've been around for so long. Samuel Edson came over from England to Salem, Massachusetts. He and his wife came over and had brought they had brought some kids with them, had more in Salem, and had their last two children here in Bridgewater. Her name is Susan, her maiden name was Bickley, and she was also born in England. They came here. For some reason, I don't know whether they were kind of drafted or whatever to come to Bridgewater, because he is the first mill owner in town. He built the first cotton mill in town. And he was awarded a double portion of land, along with this man here, James Keith, who was the first pastor. Everyone else got a single portion, and there were a total of 56 of them that were some of the original signers of the settlement. And so he came here, and they had 8 or 9 kids, and they all grew up here. And one of his daughters, Susanna, whose name is also Susanna, married this man, the first pastor of this town, which is James Keith. Right here. Right? James Keith was born in Aberdeen, Scotland, and came over in the early 1660s to Boston. Got to know Cotton Mather, and Cotton Mather brought him down here to Bridgewater, thinking they needed a pastor, because every town needed a pastor once they got settled. Because the church and the state and the town were all intertwined. And part of the taxes paid in the town helped pay the pastor's salary. So they needed a pastor. So he came in with their first pastor, and he was here their pastor until 1719 when he died. His wife, Susan, as I said, was the daughter of Samuel Edson. They had a good dozen kids, most of whom stayed at least a generation in Bridgewater and were able to raise their families here. Now, James Keith's tomb was originally built by a man named William Hudson. William Hudson's buried over in the first cemetery in Bridgewater. William Hudson had come down from Lancaster, Massachusetts to Bridgewater to settle here after the Indians had destroyed Lancaster and some of his family had been killed. I think he decided it was best to leave the area. So he came down here, and he was a stonemason. So he built the original tomb. This is not the original, just so you know. Over the years it has deteriorated, and then in the 1800s some of his ancestors had a new tomb built, or rebuilt the old one. So this is what they did, and this is where you will see Samuel Keith. He is the one that, his house is still standing over on River Road, which is the oldest standing wooden framed parsonage in the United States. It's still standing. Daniel Perkins was the second pastor of the first church in West Bridgewater, is now West Bridgewater. He followed James Keith and was here for several years. He died in 1839, so from 1819 roughly, when James Keith died, until 1839 he served as the pastor. He was the second pastor from 1720 to 1782. That would be Daniel Perkins. And I would say this is probably his son behind me with a nice flag by him. As I said, this is the grave right here of Shepherd Fisk. Shepherd Fisk is one of the first doctors in town. Not children's graves. Born in 1703. And Alice is here too. They're in the same grave, or right beside each other. There's no separate stone for Alice. Alice's maiden name was Alger. and her birth name was Patience. After her mother died when she was 3 years old, they changed her name to Alice. And that's what she went by for the rest of her life. It makes trying to find her in the genealogy records a little difficult because they changed her name.
Now this cemetery was just recently cleaned.
Yes.
The town of West Bridgewater hired a specialty corporation group to come in, and what happens is they not only clean the faces of each of the stones, but they raise them up. If you were here before they did this work, half of the writing or the epitaphs would be missing, and you weren't able to read when the person died or some of the significant writings or epitaphs that were on their stones. So this all happened last year. So we're really fortunate to have such a great cemetery to
start with.
To
It really
start
was
with,
great.
absolutely.
It gave us an idea of who these people are.
Actual people buried under
Probably.
there that we don't know.
Probably.
Yeah, so that's what we
They haven't buried anybody here really since about the mid to late 1800s.
Wow.
So,
Since when?
but there's the mid to late 1800s. But actually, the shape of this is about kind of like a triangle.
Yeah.
It was expanded in 1840. I would say probably this piece went on then. I don't know for sure. There are several family members of the Lathrop family right here in this area. This is their plot, and some of them go back into the 1700s, the early 1700s as birth dates. So this is the Lathrop family, and you will see that there are plots where you'll find families all together. And this is what happened. They came and they bought this plot and it became theirs, and they would come and visit the dead and pay their respects, and then they would be buried here. And it went on for 2 or 3 generations in some cases. This pile of dirt, that is a winter tomb. That's where when people died in the winter, you couldn't shovel through the dirt to bury them, so they put them into the tomb, and in the spring they would bury them. And that's what that was. That was a holding tomb.
Wow.
It was cold. It was
fun job
frozen.
in the spring, right?
Hopefully they did it before it got too warm. This fenced-in area is the grave plot for Reverend John Reed, who was the 3rd pastor of the First Church. He also was a representative to the state legislature. He did that for several years, till about 1811. Then he retired and came back and lived in West Bridgewater, and all he did at that point was just serve as pastor. 2 of his wives are buried here. One of them has a stone. This is Phoebe, his second wife. And then the other one is on the other side. His first wife is there. He also had a son who was John Reed, who was also a representative for the state. And he is buried in another cemetery in Bridgewater. I can't remember the name at this point. But there was a family that has its roots going back pretty far from him on forward. He was actually born in Framingham, but his father was from Middleborough and his grandfather was from Bridgewater, so they kind of came full circle back to the Bridgewaters. So this is where he is buried, and sometimes you can read the very fine, it's very hard to read it because it's so faint. But as I said, this is his second wife, and his first wife, we're betting, is probably right here on the other side.
Hannah.
Yeah, Hannah, that's her name. Yep.
Yep.
Timothy Forbes and Mary Forbes. Timothy Forbes, sometimes the family has come down to spelling the name F-O-R-B-E-S, Forbes. But the original spelling when they came to Bridgewater was Forbes. I think the first one was either Edward or William. There were 2 brothers that came. One went off to Rhode Island and one stayed in this area. And the descendants came here to Bridgewater. A lot of them are buried in the Scotland Cemetery. Over in that center of town, it was the Scottish section, and they were from Scotland. But this is Timothy and his wife Mary. They're buried here. The reason I like to point these out is somewhere in here, and there used to be a gravestone. There's a gravestone for their son Dwelly, spelled D-W-E-L-L-E-Y. He died when he was 8 years old. They were building a church here in Bridgewater, the Baptist church, and he got hit on the head by a 2x4. Basically, got hit on the head and died. And he was buried here. And his parents, we're assuming that he's buried here with his parents. So that's this little family. This is the tomb of Oakes. His first name was Oakes. his last name is Angier. He was a lawyer. When he went to law school, he went to Harvard first, but they didn't have technically law schools. And how people became lawyers is they read the law with another lawyer. He read the law with John Quincy Adams.
Wow.
In Braintree, yes. He was considered a brilliant young man. Came over here and married and settled here. Unfortunately, he died when he was in his 40s, very young, of some disease. You don't know what it is. We don't know what it is, but it always refers to it as a debilitating disease. It could have been a cancer. It could have been anything.
Could have been TB,
Yeah.
tuberculosis.
Well, usually that's pretty quick. And
Yeah.
he seems to have been aware of it for a long time. He married Susan. He married a Howard. Who would have guessed? How many Howards are there?
around here.
He married her, and they had 6 children. And his youngest son was called Oakes, and was born the year before his father died. His father died in 1786. He is the son of John Angier and Mary Bourne. You will find the name Angier was carried on through the generations as the families married. He died, he says he died of what they call the lingering and incurable malady. And in a letter written by a member of the state convention, it says when he found his fate was determined, so he knew he was going to be dying. He met it with unusual composure. And he practiced law in Bridgewater with John Turner and Samuel Oakham. And one of the things they had to do was arrange auctions for people that had passed away. So they did an auction for Josiah Edson, who had also been a lawyer. And what they were auctioned off were 80 acres of land in Taunton, 11 acres of fresh meadowland in Taunton, 40 acres of woodlands in Bridgewater, and 8.5 acres of meadowland in the west precinct of Bridgewater. And last but not least, they auctioned off his pew in the meeting house in the south precinct, because back then you bought your pews, and that helped pay for the maintenance on the church building. But he bought a pew, and once he died, since he had no family, it seems, to carry it on, it was sold.
He was wealthy.
Yes, he was very wealthy. And this is his second wife here. This is Susan Howard, and Susan Howard Angier. And she died after him, because after he died, she married a man named Jesse Forbes, another one of the Forbes family. And then she died in 1893, and then Jesse Forbes, moved out to the central part of Massachusetts to a town called Enfield. Anybody ever heard of Enfield, Massachusetts?
Sure.
Enfield, Massachusetts is under the Quabbin Reservoir. There were 4 towns that were drowned to make the Quabbin Reservoir. He went out there, and that's where he lived out his days, and he's buried in Ware, Massachusetts, in the Quabbin Park Cemetery, which is where they moved all the graves from those 4 towns in the 1930s. That I could not locate. It might be here somewhere. It might have disappeared over the centuries. And that's the grave of Hannah Snell. She was the wife of Josiah Snell. She was buried here rather early, probably in the early 1700s. Her grandfather was John Alden, so her grandmother was Priscilla Mullen. You will find that as the population in Plymouth expanded, people began to move outward. And actually one of the first grantors in Bridgewater was Joseph Alden. Well, actually it's her uncle, not her father. But she came over here when she married Josiah Snell. But this is what happened. But once in a while you'll see the name Alden will pop up in the graves here. And that's why, is because they moved inland. And this belongs to James Ames. He was born in 1783. This is my kind of grave, my kind of tombstone, because it has his complete genealogy on it, going back. He's the son of Joshua, the grandson of Benjamin, great-grandson of John, great-great-grandson of John of West Bridgewater, who was born in Braintree in 1647. Now the Ames family has been in Bridgewater for a long time. Many say, obviously, since the beginning. But a lot of times, as time went on, they began to move over into Easton. And his descendants started the Olive Ames Shovel Works, and they were part of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. They were quite a wealthy family. Now, one of the fathers of Oliver Ames is right here, John Ames. And he was in the Revolutionary War, and he died in the late 1700s. But the interesting thing about him is if you go to Easton, to the village cemetery, you will find his name on a monument to the Ames family. What they did is they wanted to have their complete genealogy on there, so I think that's what happened, because he is buried here.
Would that be considered a
A
cenotaph?
cenotaph, yeah, they call it a cenotaph or a memorial. Yes. This is Sylvanus Ames. Sylvanus and John are related. They're not father, son, they aren't brothers, but they are related. He also served in the Revolutionary War. The difference is he died in 1778 at Valley Forge. He was down there, and he died there, got sick and died. He is not buried here. This is a cenotaph again. This is where they put the memorial because a lot of his family is here. They're pretty sure he's buried in Valley Forge, but nobody knows where. A lot of the soldiers that died down there, they just buried them in unmarked graves. So this is Sylvanus. He died, he left a wife and 4 children, 4 young children, because he had married in 1768, so they were very young. Okay, so that's all I have to share with you today, folks.
Thank you.
I hope you found it interesting.
Thank you. Yes, very much. Thank you.